When you think of real-life influences on fictional characters, you'll typically think of Charlie Chaplin's parody of Adolf Hitler in his infamous film The Great Dictator. Or you'll think of Chuck Wepner as an influence for Rocky Balboa due to his near victory over Muhammad Ali as an underdog. Fiction is well known for its real-life influences, ranging from the director or author's personal experiences in life, or their influences from other directors or authors. This can be shown in minor instances, such as Matt Groening writing The Simpsons. This can also be shown in film franchises such as Batman. Batman has always had influences for the characters that appeared in the franchise, such as, say, Batman himself being based off of Zorro from the franchise of the same name in 1919. However, the biggest influences from real life come from Batman's villains. Now, it's no secret that Batman has a ton of great villains. On the movie front, there are many great villains. There are three I will go over today, being the Joker, Ra's al Ghul, and Bane. They are classic characters from Batman's media ever since their inception, but very few know about their influences as characters. We'll start with Bane, I guess you could say, because he's a relatively recent one. Now, by relatively recent, I mean he's relatively recent for a Batman villain, as he was introduced in 1993. Despite being introduced in 1993, he's still one of the most popular Batman villains maybe ever, which is pretty odd when you consider new Batman villains. You see, there are a few contrary opinions over what influences Bane had from. This could range from different types of action films. Arnold Schwarzenegger was reportedly a common example of an influence. But from what I could gather from the writers themselves, the biggest influence I found was from the Count of Monte Cristo, mainly Edmond Dantes from the Count of Monte Cristo. If you don't know that book, it's a book written in 1846, which features a 19-year-old revolutionary being arrested after getting into a feud with a high-ranking French official, I think during the Bourbon Restoration, which would have been after Napoleon. So this French revolutionary is sent to jail, where he spends 9 years planning a way to get back at the people who wronged him, and then of course he ends up getting revenge on the same people who threw him in jail. And the French official. Now, infamously, tell me if this at all sounds familiar. You have this man who was a revolutionary in a fictional Caribbean nation called Santa Prisca. He escapes his failed revolution, and the Santa Priscan government just openly decides, okay, because he managed to escape, let's decide to imprison his son as a way of making him pay his penance for it. So, essentially, his son has to carry on his sentence along with his wife. His wife dies when his son is the age of 6, and he spends his entire childhood in prison being essentially raised by other prisoners before he can plan his revenge on the people who wronged him and escape prison. If that sounds at all familiar to the Count of Monte Cristo, congratulations. You now know how similar Bane's origin story is to the Count of Monte Cristo. It's a tale as old as time, whether you like it or not. It's the getting revenge on people who wronged you in a court of law has been a common influence probably since the Renaissance, I would argue. I mean, there's a lot of stories of that from the Renaissance. It's a very interesting story for Bane, especially since he would eventually become the man who would break the bat, metaphorically, in 93's Nightfall. Ra's al Ghul is another villain from the Batman universe with numerous influences since his inception. When he debuted in 1971, his influences largely range around Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, if you know anything about the character, it adds up considering he is a character that cannot die. That is his entire character. He cannot die, is trying to take over the world because he can't die, and his attitude becomes clouded because of that. But generally speaking, when it comes to his personality, Dracula may be the biggest inspiration, I would say. Now, there are a lot of people who played Dracula, and it's cited that there were a few actors who played the villain who played the villain Dracula, who I would argue had a lot to do with the portrayal of Ra's al Ghul. The main one being Christopher Lee, who would later play Saruman and Count Dooku in Star Wars and a few other characters. His influence was notable on Ra's al Ghul in the sense that his Dracula was more charismatic, commanding, aristocratic compared to other iterations of the character. So notably, when Ra's al Ghul was created, Christopher Lee's Dracula was such a common influence that it's almost comical, honestly. Ra's al Ghul is shown to be a master manipulator, similarly to Christopher Lee's Dracula. He's also shown to be a warrior that can live forever. Obviously, Christopher Lee's Dracula is obviously shown as, obviously he can live forever unless he's in sunlight, obviously, and that's a very common trope with Dracula. And I will also bring up the master manipulator is very important to understanding Ra's al Ghul, in the sense that part of the reason why he's such an interesting Batman villain was because he found out who Batman's true identity was through manipulation. If you don't know the story, he used his daughter as a way to manipulate Batman into revealing his true identity when he was still feuding with him. So this, of course, led to his daughter deducing it, which led to her telling him, and obviously that led to instances where Batman's identity was on the line, and he kind of had that hanging over his head. So yeah, very much of a master manipulator, and that obviously comes from Dracula. And of course, finally, we have the Joker, a character that is so recognizable that some use the character as a common example of villainy. But of course, before the days of Joaquin Phoenix's Oscar win for playing the character in 2019, or Heath Ledger's posthumous Oscar win for playing the character in 2008, the general character is still in debate over what exactly its influences were. Because while the two actors obviously had broader influences for how the Joker could be portrayed, Heath Ledger, for example, used Brendan Lee's The Crow as an example of how he should portray the Joker. And Joaquin Phoenix used Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver as an example of an influence. Bob Kane and Bill Finger, on the other hand, came up with the idea that from the Joker from a Victor Hugo novel that became a film in the 1920s titled The Man Who Laughs. You can see where I'm going with this, don't you? See, the main character is very well known for his creepy smile, which obviously is very similar to the Joker, who also has a creepy smile. The general look for the character resembles the actor who played the character in the 1928 film. Eventually, because of the film's setting and a few other ideas, it morphed into a few other ideas, such as making him a killer clown because the character was originally supposed to be a jester. Make him psychotic because the character's known for psychosis, and a few other scenarios that have popped up here and there. Essentially, the Joker was a very revolutionary character for his time, as he was a common symbol for what's evil in the world. Essentially, I'm doing evil things and I don't care, which is similar to the character here. Now, the character was a very big success with readers when he first debuted, as Batman, up to that point, had generally fought low-level thugs, and there wasn't really any major villains that stuck at that point. However, the issue is that because of how dark the character was during his inception, he had to be toned down a bit from the 1940s to the 1980s due to the attitude that the character glorified violence. This is, oddly enough, an attitude that actually still sticks around somewhat to this day after Joaquin Phoenix's Joker. And honestly, I think despite every single attempt to get rid of that, it's probably not going to go away anytime soon. But regardless, at the end of the day, it's common to look at characters in fiction and ignore their broad influences. Which is why when you typically watch a film, you typically don't think, oh, I recognize this from somewhere, if it's very subtle. Which is why it's always interesting to look at a famous character and how they came into development. As the old saying goes, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Thank you for listening.